Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring, improvisation. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Christian, we like things that are planned and structured. What on earth does improvisation have to do with human risk? Well, it's a subject I've explored before with comedian and writer Neil Malarkey. There's a link to that in the show notes. My conversation with Neil led me to want to dive into a little bit deeper. So in this episode, I'm speaking to Heather Urquhart. She's a professional improviser who not only performs in theatre, but also works to help businesses to manage uncertainty and drive creativity. In a world where we don't know exactly what's going to happen and resources are constrained, the skills that allow improvisers to entertain us are also relevant to the business world. While improvisers may look like they're making things up as they go along, as you'll hear, they have plans in place to allow them to manage that and to drive their creativity. In my discussion with Heather, we look at how skills like active listening and a non-judgmental approach to creative ideas can transform all aspects of an organisation, not just the areas that you might think of as being traditionally creative. Now, true to our theme, Heather and I set out on our conversation with a very open agenda, and that took us to some really interesting and unexpected places. But it also meant that we just kept going, so much so that there's enough content not just for one episode, but two. So what you're about to hear is part one of a two-part discussion. I think what Heather has to say is absolutely fascinating. So please enjoy, as I know you will, the fabulous Heather Urquhart for part one of our discussion on improvisation. Heather, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you, Christian. Happy New Year, because as we just discussed, it's always New Year and cocktail hour somewhere in the world.
It is, and even if it isn't New Year anywhere now, if people wait long enough, it will be, and so you're just doing it early or very late, depending on whatever. So either
exactly,
way.
a stopped clock is always right twice a day, right?
Brilliant. And I guess that people can already see in the creative way that you responded to my statement that you do something rather interesting. To start us off, tell my listeners a little bit about yourself.
I would love to. My name is Heather Urquhart. I'm a professional improviser. I run a company called And Also Improv that brings the world of improvisation and creative, spontaneous thinking to businesses and organizations. But I also perform improvisation. I'm in a West End musical called Showstopper, the improvised musical, that just happens to be completely made up. So we have a full band, a full 2-act musical show, but we don't know what we're doing before it starts. So I feel like I'm in a good position to teach people about what it's like to make things up on the spot.
Wow. I'd love to come and talk about the musical, but looking at the business side of it, just unpick, why is that ability to make things up as you go along? What use is that to business?
I think I think there's so many applications. But I think, in short, that the most useful definition to me is a lot of the time people say to me as an improviser, oh, so you're an improviser, you go into situations without a plan, and that's what this is about. And I say, no, it's the opposite, actually. I go into situations always with a plan, but I have the tools to cope when the plan doesn't go to plan, because let's face it, what situations in life ever really go to plan exactly as you thought they would?
Well, they never do, right? It's
Exactly. And I think what's really interesting to me, because I work with lots of different types of people, the higher up in an organization you go, the worse the sort of sunk resources stuff gets, and that people cannot own up to mistakes or things going wrong, or they hold on to plans more rigidly, thinking that they can actually control the world that they're in. And of course, that's just not possible. So, we're never saying be spontaneous all the time. We're just saying what happens when things change. Are you able to change? Are you able to pivot, adapt, be agile? All these things that people talk about in business these days, because the world's moving so fast and changing so fast. But can people actually do that? Because a lot of people say they can, but in reality, they can't. It's a hard thing to do. And as an improviser, I know it's a hard thing to do. So someone who trains this stuff and does it all the time, I think it's a really useful skill, and it's not practiced very much. It's sort of undervalued a bit, I think.
And so I've seen you perform, for want of a better phrase. Can you just tell my listeners a little bit about the sorts of things that you do? So what would happen when someone gets you in? Because I think it's important to understand what does the sort of the product look like.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when we met, I was performing, right? We were doing musical stuff at a conference, and that's a really interesting job because actually I find that in those situations, my job is to actually be less creative. And my job is to really listen to what it is that people are saying to me and just reflect it back to them. And in that case, through song, right? People will tell us about their experience of the day, their experience of something bigger. And our job is to listen and then, turn that into music for them, reinterpret it, if you will. And that's a slightly different job if we're going into a business and we're asking people to do that themselves. So again, a lot of the job is teaching people to be present, to listen, to not judge their ideas actually, because a lot of the time I find when people say they're not creative, it's just not true. It's just they put a label on themselves saying, oh, I'm not creative, and everyone's creative. So I really enjoy going into any organization and making people realize that they are complete creative comedy geniuses, because everybody is, I think.
I'd agree with that, and I think one of the sort of implicit in my original sort of question was this idea that they're not the same. But actually, if we think about our own interactions day to day with individuals, we always find little things that make us laugh, equally, or things that make us cry. I think the things that provoke a reaction in us. I think this is a skill set that we all inherently have, and so I guess what you're doing is helping them bring that out, recognize that it's there, and that it can be incredibly useful within organizations. There are some functions, things like marketing, where creativity and on research and development, where creativity is permitted and you're allowed to think crazy thoughts and do it. But then the rest of the organization, that is in some cases not permitted at all, or if it is permitted, it's permitted in very small ways. And so what I think is interesting about what you do is you're basically saying, actually, it's inherent in all of us and it's useful to all of us. And let's think about how that might work. And so you're really bringing something out of people that's naturally there anyway.
Oh, 100%. And also, I think what you're saying about where it's permitted or not is really useful in terms of, really interesting in terms of what you talk about, which is the risk factor, right? Which is when I'm talking about creativity in an improvisational context, I'm not talking about painting a picture or singing a song. Normally, I'm talking about doing what you can with a set of resources that is not enough to do the thing that you need to do it with, right? That's being creative in terms of what I'm talking about in people's work lives. I'm not an expert in what they do, but I think everybody can relate to, okay, we need to think outside the box here and find a new way of doing this and work it out. And so we're using the kind of the language of improv and improvisational theatre and comedy to help people thinking about those ideas. And, everybody needs to be able to do that. But I think a lot of the time it gets put onto bits of organizations like they're the creative ones, they do this. And actually everybody needs to do that in some way in their jobs. And actually looking at, I love a lot of the content you post about compliance in the wild, because to me, a lot of those are great examples of improvisations and people thinking outside the box. And I love all that stuff, that I don't necessarily equate it all with theatre. It's just humans and what happens when unexpected things happen and how do we cope with it. And that's what I love about the stuff that I do. And yeah, I'm so lucky I get to do it on stage, but I like watching it happen, as you say, in the wild, right? Because it happens all the time.
And I really like this idea of improvising that we would all recognize from, every single one of us has, for example, used a chair as a ladder.
Yes.
They tell you not to do it. There's warning signs on it, right? And it is, of course, particularly as, and I speak from bitter personal experience here, if you try and do it, for example, with an office chair that has wheels and you're trying to stretch and reach something and the wheels aren't as stabilized as you thought, we know how this story ends. And so,
Does that happen to you?
maybe, right? It's just as hypothetical, right? Right.
Okay.
Don't do that at home, kids. Or do and learn a valuable lesson from it and don't do it again. Whatever. But I think there's a good example of, we all recognize there are times when we cut corners and improvise. And that might be because we haven't got the time, we haven't got the money, or we just can't be asked, right? And it's just like there's a simpler solution. And so I always think the context of like DIY at home. Right? I'm not going to pay to have someone come in, because how hard can this be? And we've all probably got examples around our property of things where we've experimented, where we haven't solved the problem properly, but we've kind of done enough to get it. And probably if you're me, you may have had to call people out to rectify the mess that you've made. But we've all done that on some level, right? We've used things for purposes that they're not intended to be used for. We've played with things, we've cut corners, we've not listened, we've ignored instructions or sensible way of doing this to get things done. And so I like this idea of saying, if we recognize we do that domestically. Now, of course, there are going to be situations in work environments. You don't want somebody doing the kind of experimenting I was talking about when it comes to dealing with I don't know, a nuclear power station, or like if you're driving a forklift truck or something, right? There are certain situations where clearly different rules need to apply. But there are, I think, increasingly, as I look at, machines are doing repeat predictable tasks. So if it's an environment where you can predict what needs to happen, you can give it to a machine generally, and they'll do it more
Yeah,
consistently than humans. So what are we employing people to do? Well, the answer is the things the machines can't. I think that's where your work comes in, right? Is you're not suggesting that people should improvise all of the time, and there are times it's not appropriate in certain contexts, but increasingly for what people are doing, we do want them to be more human, and we do want to bring that, and that's one of the things that we're really good at. So you're bringing out something that's naturally there that I think is increasingly a powerful and useful skill that we all recognize in other environments is useful.
absolutely. And I think a lot of it as well is knowing when to improvise and when to not, knowing when to think divergently or convergently, having self awareness of what it is that you, as an individual, are actually doing within a team or organization. Because some people don't know that they're improvising or not. That's the thing I think is really interesting, is that sometimes if we're going to teach collaboration, people genuinely think they're being collaborative. And I'm watching them shut each other's ideas down in order to put their own idea forward. And that's not collaboration. That's just a list of people saying their own idea. So it's really interesting. And as you say, it's not necessary that we want to do that stuff all the time, but we just need to be aware of the tools that we need to do it and when we're doing it and when we're not. And I think that's the thing that is hidden away sometimes. And actually there's a real methodology to that, because I know that you were asking about that before, what are the things that happen when one is improvising? And it's quite nice to shine a light on that. And again, I was saying before that giving people the tools to cope when a plan goes wrong or a plan doesn't go to plan. But actually, further to that, people associate improvising with when something's gone wrong, rather than like, oh, this is an opportunity to look at things differently or see things differently or react differently, and not wait for things to go wrong, actually, to get upstream of that and think about doing things differently for the positive reason.
And I love that, because you're right. Is often when something's gone hideously wrong, suddenly budgets become available, and we have the permission to think differently about it. And of course, the way we've always been doing, we've got to but look at that, either because we genuinely think we need to, or maybe someone's told us we have to have a look at it, regulator or someone else has decided we need to look at it. And so there's permission to think differently.
Definitely.
But I love this idea of saying, well, why don't we do that all the time, right? Why wait for something to go wrong before you're allowed to shift course? And so I really like the delineation you made of saying it's not every single moment should we be improvising and do these, right? Recognize it's a skill to have, and it's a skill that we can deploy. But we don't necessarily need to wait for permission to use it because circumstances have changed. We should recognize there's a value to it every single day. And so having it in your toolkit, therefore knowing the strengths and weaknesses of it and where it's appropriate or not appropriate, is kind of where you're going, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a huge thing I observe as well is cultures and organizations where it's okay to speak up, throw out crazy ideas, make mistakes, experiment, try things out. And that becomes embedded in how people operate, as opposed to the opposite, right? Which is that you get this downward spiral of communication and risk taking, where people go, oh, if I say something or I do something and it doesn't work, then it will be, laughed at in the worst case scenario or ignored. So then people stop contributing ideas and trying things out because they're doing it into a void. And I think that's the thing that I find really powerful with the stuff that we do, is that we're sort of saying, are you in an atmosphere where you feel you can be creative and contribute and make mistakes? And like I was saying before, I think sometimes the higher up people go in an organization, the more people worry about that stuff. And actually it takes huge guts to keep taking risks.
And the bit I find fascinating is when you look at super successful people like Jeff Bezos at Amazon, for example,
Yeah.
undeniably has created something out of nothing.
Yeah.
Has created this behemoth. Now we can question some of the business practices and all those sorts of things, but I love his approach to experimentation and recognize. He places bets on things, and he doesn't matter. Like some of them don't work out at all. I mean, he had the Amazon Fire phone, I think was a thing. But things like Amazon Web Services works. His main business works pretty well.
Yeah.
So as you look at it, you sort of think, well, here's somebody who's carried that forward. And as I say, I'm not praising them as a business in all aspects of what they do, but when he talks about it, he always talks about experimentation, and that's kind of improv. Let's give a go with this, because unless we try it, we won't know. And actually, we should try some counterintuitive things and some things that are stupid, because we know in lots of other contexts, things that sound silly or make no sense whatsoever, or we can't justify, but actually let's just try the opposite way of doing things that might work out. All of those things
Oh my God. There's gold in that. Gold.
are what you point towards, right? That's what comes out of the processes that you talk about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot of productivity in silliness and laughter that people don't necessarily realize. And we're trying to sort of, I guess sometimes when we go in, we sort of take it to the other end so that people kind of ping back to the middle. Because you'd be amazed if we go to do like ideation sessions. You ever heard of like the term BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal?
Yes.
So that's the thing people throw around a lot, and we'll go in and sometimes in some situations our job might be to like help people think about these things and ideate with them. And if you say, think of an idea that just like that's completely crazy in your industry that just you don't think would work. And it surprises me how tame the ideas are. I mean, when I say you can ignore the rules of space, time, the law, everything, you can do anything. Budget's unlimited. This is your chance to go imaginatively wild. And people will often say, oh, I think maybe we should have sushi for lunch in the canteen, And I'm like, come on. But I mean, that's a bit cruel. But I think one of the things is getting people to feel free and practice big, huge ideas so that, what is it inside of that idea that's interesting and you can keep? And if you shut down that process too early, then you don't get to that point, but you get these new, I mean, you think there's so many examples, aren't there, of discoveries that came from accidents. I mean, penis, Velcro, Play-Doh, there's so many of them. But people found something they weren't necessarily looking for by doing another process, and then something else came out of it. And I love all those, real life examples of that stuff. So I like helping people get there by just try something that you don't think is going to work, and then let's see what sticks.
One of the things that always intrigues me about this is you're right. It's when you sort of have these conversations, and I'm saying this not in a sort of critical sense, because I'm now in an environment where I work for myself, so I can do what the hell I like within reason. But when I've been in corporate environments, I've also fallen foul of this. I can see how it happens, but you're right. It's kind of, you give people permission to think differently, and they think differently within sort of safe parameters. So I don't know, if you were running a coffee shop, a radical thought might be, let's not serve coffee, let's serve tea.
Yeah.
And yeah, okay, that is it's not massively radical, because most coffee shops do serve tea on some level, but it's a very small step away from, it's sort of, you just change the nature of the drink that you've served. You haven't really gone radical.
Yeah.
And so I think that, as you're talking, I'm not surprised, given my background, why people feel unwilling to do that. And it's partly they've never been given permission to do it.
Yeah.
And therefore those muscles haven't been exercised. But it's also because you feel like even if I'm allowed to be, I sort of need to be corporately improvising, and that comes with limits. And what you're saying to people, and I love this idea of push it to the limits, because you're not actually genuinely saying, well, some of the ideas that you'll come up with, the limits, are clearly ridiculous, right? If you remove constraints like gravity or time, right, that's not realistic. But you're doing that to kind of get people to go a million miles away, and then you come back to something that is feasible.
I mean, we could do it now. Should we try it?
Let's do it.
Okay, so if you could do anything with your business completely outside of the constraints of legality, time, budget, what would it be?
So I think if I look at,
go silly, go really silly, like I want hoverboards with my name on it or something.
Yeah. So the purpose of my business, right, is sort of for me to be able to deliver, and to a certain extent, I'm driving already, is I do things I want to do, right? So the business strategy is already reasonably free in the sense of it does things, doesn't. So I might even start by being ridiculous and say, right, I'm going to find the thing I really hate doing, right? Take the opposite spirit of the business and go, let's do something I would absolutely detest.
Yeah.
Right. Which would be doing something incredibly dull, incredibly tedious. So I will open I'll do, God, what would be really, really dull? Something that's incredibly tedious. I wouldn't want to do.
Yeah. What would be the dullest thing for you? Because I don't know what the dullest thing for you would be. I know what it might be for me, but.
I tell you what I hate doing, right? I hate tidying stuff up.
Great.
Right. Can't stand it. Right. So, okay. I'm going to open.
So you did a job as a tidier.
Right. I'm going to basically, it's like Marie Kondo, right? I
Yeah.
get what but I find so I love what she does. I think it's an amazing thing, but I think it's really inhumane, right? And I think it's
Right.
unrealistic. And so I would open, like, what would be more extreme version of that? So
Yeah.
like I don't know, we go around and we force everybody to tidy up against their best will. So just something obscene like that. Make it compulsory for people to do something. There's a bit of compliance for you. No, something
Okay.
like that. Something around that. I mean, even that's not really. I feel like now that we've had the conversation about people being constrained, I feel like I ought to be really radical, and that doesn't feel really
No,
radical.
no. But I think this is the thing. It's like, so the thing that interests me about this is it's something in what you said. There's a kernel of an idea. So like, okay, so my business is about this. So maybe what I should do is go do the thing that I can imagine would be the worst thing ever for me, and then make loads of other people do that. So somewhere within that, I think that you then scale it back and you go, what's the truth of it? Oh, is this about me wanting to experience empathy for people who are having to comply with things that they really detest? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of what I hear from that idea. And there's a lot of fun in that. So yeah, you might not start a tidying up business, but you might go, oh, maybe I want to do some like lived experience stuff of trying to put myself in the position of people complying with ridiculous rules and applying that to my own life, for example. You know what I mean? So that would be a really small example of take it to the extreme and then just think, oh, well, why did my mind go there? Like, what
Yes.
is there in that that would be fun? And I don't know if that's true, but it just gets your mind ticking in different ways. And I think that's super fun. And I have to do it for myself as well. I mean, the other thing is I'm super risk averse. And I also find that, if I'm having a new client meeting, I'm constantly striking the balance between, am I like the creative person in this meeting or am I the corporate person in this meeting? And, how much of those two things split? How much am I saying the thing that I want the person to hear so that they give me the job so I can go in there and do a good job? And how much, am I saying whatever I want because it'd be really fun in that meeting because they're not the same. And I know that, that, like you talk about, it's finding a balance, isn't it, between what's going to work for people uh, versus, yourself versus the corporate world versus the artistic world. I find it all very, very interesting. And again, for me, I'm going into places talking about how to apply listening and collaborative thinking, which is what I use on stage. But then I have to be really honest with myself and say, oh, did I do that myself in when I was talking to my business partner? Was I really collaborating or did I go into that meeting with a fixed agenda of what I wanted to happen? And there was no way I was going to shift from it in the first place. Because, that's a huge one, isn't it? Are meetings worth having meetings if no one's willing to deviate from where they started in the meeting, in which case just send a series of RC emails.
But I love this idea of, on the one hand, right, you're selling something that's designed to encourage people to think freely and to be innovative and to challenge all that kind of stuff, right? On the other hand, as you rightly pointed out, if you were to genuinely present as sort of wild and wacky and, I don't know, turn up and do crazy, having a business meeting, you do crazy things, entirely unexpected stuff that would be very on brand. But at some point, people are just going to go, this is too much. Right? I can't handle this. I don't want these people, this is too much of a risk. And so you need to show, you need to demonstrate that you've got the capability, but there's to use the classic phrase, you're taking people on a journey. And so,
Yeah.
in a way, you're kind of having to make it. I guess it would be the equivalent of, you want to get people to eat spicy food. You don't want to show up there with like a California Reaper chili that's going to blow their heads off. When actually you need to take them on a. So you'd have something slightly spicier than they might be used to. You'd have to work out what that meant, and then you could start to do that. But you're right. You have to sort of, on the one hand, you're running a business that needs to engage with other businesses. So that requires you to conform to the rules of business. On the other hand, you're an improv business. And so you need to also not be, you don't want to look like an accountancy firm, although you could argue accountancy is full of improv, right? It's creative accounting. So that's quite an interesting tension in the subject matter that you are engaged with and the form that you need to perform to, I guess, to have a business at all.
Well, it reminds me of rule 3 in the book, Humanizing Rules, which is when putting on a show, make sure you know your audiences, which I'm somewhat jesting about, but it's really true in that if someone comes to me, what I'm trying to listen to is what is it that has brought you to improvisation as an idea? Is it because you want to improvise or is it because, you feel like your leadership teams need to be a bit more responsive to other departments, or is it because you need to communicate better? So I think it's true that I don't want to frighten people. I just want to give them a little bit of the tools that we use that's going to be useful in their life, right? It's not like I'm not trying to do a bait and switch on them. I'm just trying to genuinely be useful, And I think that's the thing I've learned over the years is I'm not teaching them improvisation, right? I'm teaching them improvisation as a means to be better at what they do. And that's sometimes manifests itself further in. I used to really desperately want everyone to really, really enjoy every moment of every session that I ran. And of course I do. Of course I want people to laugh and have a fantastic time and come out of it, transformed and blown away and, having something to take from it. But also I think I've got better at going, if people find this a bit alien and uncomfortable, then maybe that's a good thing because it's not something they usually do. And if it makes them feel, in their stretch zone, as opposed to the comfort zone, then that's okay too. People will come to it in different ways. So as you say, I'm not going to give them the Caroline Reaper straight away because they're not there to learn how to sing a song, right? Maybe they're just they're looking for a different outcome.
Right. And I love this idea of actually, what are you trying to do? Well, you're not turning them into versions of you, right?
Exactly.
They've clearly chosen a different path. Now, I contend that lots of people that are in sort of corporate environments are making massive compromises that you clearly aren't, right? Because you clearly love what you do and enjoy it, and it suits you, and it's the sort of, if I looked at the job spec, it's very tightly correlated with what you might term the sort of the Heather desire list, right? Because you don't go into the business that you're in if you don't enjoy it, because it's bloody hard work.
True. Yeah.
And you won't succeed if you're no good at it, right? So it's closely correlated with what you want to be. Whereas lots of other people are in a kind of, there's a job spec there of which there are certain things they'll be very, very good at, certain things that they want to stretch themselves to, and certain things that, frankly, if that was 100% of the job, you wouldn't hire them for. And so
Yeah.
when you're coming in, your role isn't to turn, you're not training them to be you. What you're doing is you're trying to inspire them and trying to give them skills and useful. So I think it's really interesting when you look at that, because as you say, that isn't necessarily about them enjoying it all the time. You want them to feel awkward at moments and feel challenging, but equally you don't want them to feel awkward the whole bloody time and think, well, I can't do this. She's really good at this. I could never do that. You want to give them a sense of there is a potential there, and it's not about replicating what you do. It is about you transmitting a vibe and some skills and some ideas and some ways of thinking that they can then deploy in their own world. That's relevant and sensible for the environments that they're in. And I think it's fascinating when we look at. I think this is a really good example of a sort of 21st century training, because historically companies have engaged in training, which is things like time management, treating people with respect, sort of very basic stuff, or how to use Excel, or those sorts of things, where it is a one size fits all. And I'm going to teach you a firm syllabus, and you take away this syllabus and everybody will have the same skill set. And I think what's interesting about what you're doing is you're trying to bring out something in people. They have to want to bring it out, otherwise there's no point. And some of that is about saying, well, actually, it's a way of thinking that, it might manifest itself in a completely different way in those people. And that's absolutely fine. They may not break out into song, but that's not the objective. But you are still, there's that core kernel there. And so I think it's a really interesting, it's a much more challenging skill set, because you're not kind of going, okay, well, on today's syllabus, as long as I've got through these 4 points, I've taught them these, like old school teaching, right? I'll teach you 20 historical facts and then my job is done. Or what you're doing is you're trying to bring something out of them that's naturally there already. And so that's quite it's quite, in a way, it's a big leap for companies to be buying this, because they don't exactly know what they're buying. And you can't exactly point to the results that you're going to get, but we all intuitively recognize what it is.
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think of a couple of things. Number one is that one thing I will often talk to, whoever gets us into an organization, is whether they call the training improvisation or not. Because some of them really want to, and some of them don't. And it's got pros and cons on both sides. Because sometimes an organization says, we're going to get these improvisers in, and they tell their staff it's been booked in for months. And that those are the staff that feel very introverted and very, very anxious, and maybe have had a bad experience in the performing arts or anything in their former years. They will get really anxious like genuinely anxious for weeks leading up to this thing, and sometimes calling sick, and I'll just come. Just the thought of it worries them so much, and I don't want anyone to feel like that, and because that's not what we do when we get in the room. A lot of the stuff we do is in pairs and small groups. Just thinking about ideas. It's not getting up there and sing a song by yourself. So sometimes people will say, "Okay, we're going to do a session. It's called agile communication," which is what improv does. But we just don't even have to use the word improv because maybe that's not the thing we're focusing on today. And then we can do some exercises, and we can or cannot mention at the beginning or the end of the session, "Oh, by the way, we come from a background of improvised theatre, and that's why we're qualified to talk about this stuff." But it's not like what we're focusing on. It's just the means to get there. And I never, so there's pros and cons for both, right? And I never quite know which way to play it. And on top of that, as you say, when you're talking to clients and trying to explain what you do, I find that if I'm facilitating a session, I've got to keep myself honest and improvise as I'm facilitating that session, right? So if something's landing really well, I might ditch the plan and spend more time on that thing, or vice versa. If something's not landing, then it's okay, well, we'll pivot. So maybe these people need this on this day. So that in itself is very improvisational. But then you work with people who are like, "I want to do an improv session, but please can you tell me everything that's going to happen in that improv session before I say yes to it?" Which is a really interesting thing again. Because I can't lie, it's improvised. I can tell you the shape of the exercises, but I can't tell you what's going to come out of them. So there's some very interesting stuff.
And I love that because I guess, to your point, it comes to the challenge we all have when we're providing to companies. There's sometimes it's a case of personal preferences. Sometimes it's what you call it will unlock a budget that if you called it something else, you couldn't use it for. So, training budgets might be different to a budget that you've got for an away day or an offsite. And so it needs to be badged appropriately. But actually it also goes not just to the form, but to the substance of what you're doing. And I think that's really interesting. And I guess part of the challenge here is that the very reason you have a business in the first place is that these are not things that sit nicely in existing buckets. Because if organizations had teams of people that were doing what you were doing, there wouldn't be a need for you, but the organization would think differently about this. They don't exist. You're bringing something fresh in that doesn't neatly fit in the existing structures. And that's why there's an opportunity for you. But that also means you're having to match yourself to their structures and work out what environment are you in. And sometimes I also think and I have this as well, it's like what people think they want and what they might actually want are two different things.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yes. And that's interesting as well. I think as I get older, I'm a lot better now at saying, actually, I don't think that we're going to be able to help you. I don't think that we're the people for you.
Right.
I mean, an example, it's a really boring example, but people will often say, "Oh, we want some role play." I go, "Oh, that's not what we do. We're not going to make a script of your office politics and then play it back to you or get you to play it out. We do something different. We, get people to tell stories and play games and do things that kind of simulate the dynamics and stuff that they have in their work. But it's not their work. So we're not experts in that. We're experts in like playfulness and spontaneity and being really present to what's happening in the room. So, and that's not role play. So these that, before I'd say, "Oh, maybe we could do something." And now I say, "Oh, no, I don't think we can." But I know loads of great people that do that really well. I'll send them, and even maybe presentation skills. I'll be really honest and I'll say, "Look, we can have a lot of fun helping people with presentation, but it's by doing things like getting them to present on a topic that doesn't exist or doing it in a certain way, and kind of, again, playing with it. But if you want me to get you to coach you on your presentation that you're doing, which is a lot more on the nose, I guess, or dry, I know loads of people that'd be really great at doing that for you, but it might not be for us, our organization. And, how much you adapt to that kind of thing is interesting, right? Because you should adapt, but not so much that you lose your authenticity. That's the word, isn't it? Your integrity of what you're doing. That's a big balance.
Yeah, and which is ironic, right? Because you talk about improv, which suggests that you can handle any situation, right? Whatever comes your way, you'll be ready to deal with it. And so there's an interesting thing there where you've kind of gone, actually, it doesn't mean it. That's a good illustration, I think, of well, actually, improv doesn't mean any business that comes our way will fudge it and get through it, right? actually in that situation, you're going, well, I don't want to improv. I'm not comfortable in that space. And it was really interesting when you talk in those terms, because I get people approaching me to do certain things. The title of my business, Human Risk, is unhelpful in some respects because people read into it things that I'd never intended. And so that opens doors that are amazing, where I go, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, delighted to help you with that. Wouldn't have approached that. I work with sectors I wouldn't have thought about solving problems I would never have thought about solving before. Totally different context to things I've ever done before, but it works. Equally, it opens up doors where you just think, oh my God, that's really not what I'm about. And so I can imagine with yours, just what you've called yours, that risk is probably even greater, because people will read into things that they want, and maybe they don't know who to go and get help from. And so it feels like you ought to be able to help them, or you could help them, whatever. They like the idea of helping. And so I think that idea of being not purist in the sense of kind of very, very rigid. You do need to know what it is you don't do or wouldn't do, so that you can avoid doing it, because I think that's the sign. Otherwise you're letting the rest of the brand down. You kind of think, so it's a case of simultaneously being really open to things, but also recognizing where the limits are.
And you don't want to miss out, right? It comes back to that know your audience thing. I mean, sometimes I find myself at the end of a meeting, I'm going through lots of logistics. Quite often, it's when someone has said, we really do want to work with you. And, maybe we've already signed the contract or something, and we're having a sort of prep call and talking about what we're going to do and things like that. And sometimes we're talking in such serious terms, which we should, because I take my job really seriously. And obviously the organization's invested in this training, that I sometimes just have to say, everyone's going to laugh a lot. Is that okay? Because I just sometimes need to reality check it,
which I think is inherently funny, right?
But it's like, sometimes we talk seriously about things. I don't want to missell people. And I will have to sort of say to people, there's a lot of value in this, but it is very playful and people are going to enjoy it a lot. And actually, that's one thing we often say is, do they want fun disguised as learning, or learning disguised as fun? Because we can do both. And it just depends on what people are looking for in that experience. Some people need help to be simple.
Yes.
And I want to help them.
Right. And what I think is interesting about what you do is that a sort of primitive analysis, and I say that not from a sense of I'm sophisticated, but sort of, the start point would be, this is all about having fun. And this is all about, let's just see what happens, and let's no planning, no nothing. But actually what's interesting about what you do is that there is, take this the right way, method behind the madness.
I do take it the right way. I take it excellently.
And so I'm intrigued by that balancing act, because I guess it's a little bit like comic timing is, some of the best comedians out there know exactly what they're doing, and things that look spontaneous aren't necessarily. And
100%. Yeah, 100%. One of the biggest eye-openers for me, I was in Edinburgh one year, and we were on after a fantastic comedian called Keith Thornan, an Irish stand-up comedian. And because we were on directly after him, I'd quite often go in and watch like the last 15 minutes of his set. And I watched his whole show, actually, and I loved it. But I thought, I'll go and see it again. And I couldn't believe the differences and similarities from one night to another in terms of specific, even the way he would sigh or move his head. It was so finely crafted. And yet, on the other hand, if the audience weren't into it, it would be so deftly changed so very quickly. So I think that those degrees to which things can change or be the same in such a small way are really, really interesting. You're a keynote speaker, right? I guess you have I don't know how many talks you have, or if you're talking about the same thing, but I bet that changes a lot from moment to moment, depending on who you're talking to, does it?
So I'll tell you what's really interesting about that, because one of the things that you discover when you talk to sort of traditional keynote speaker bookers or agencies or whatever, is that there is a school of thought there that says actually what they want to do is minimize risk, right? So ideally what you do is you come with a predefined menu of options. I can do a presentation on this, or this, right? And you've done it hundreds of times, and they're buying a tried and tested formula. And I heard this and I just thought, that's not how I operate at all. Because actually what I try to do is two things. I don't ever want to be one of these people that is just, we've all seen them, right? And whether that's musicians performing or people doing speeches or whatever, or politicians in particular, where it's kind of like, same crap, and it feels like they're going through the
And then
motions.
when they're dead behind the eyes.
Yeah, and it's like sort of rinse and repeat nonsense, and
Yeah.
so I don't ever want to be that person. And because what I'm doing is slightly unusual, I need to be alive and in the moment. And so I have this rule, which is that no two presentations or speeches or whatever that I do will ever be the same, even if it is the same subject for the same client. So you might get a client that wants me to do 20 of these things. None of them will be exactly the same. Of course, I'm not saying that they'll be entirely different, but none of them will be exactly the same because I'm bringing. It'll be partly because I respond to the moment. A crass example would be, I don't know, if the weather changes, something noticeable there's some feature that ought to be human you want to reference, or it might just be I want to try some new material. So I take, is experimenting with, let's just try some new imagery or just something that I've never done before. Let's see how this plays out, right? Just an experimental thing. And so I'm horrified by this idea of it being predictable, rinse and repeat, because I don't think the audience gets the best performance from me if that's happening. Now, of course, you don't want to be making the whole thing as you go along. I haven't prepared anything. Well, let's just see how this plays out, right? That's not smart. But I want that ability to come in and be absolutely fresh so that what that audience is getting requires me to be alive and in the moment and paying attention and all those kinds of things. And so I think, if I compare what I do to traditional speakers, is I'm veering very much away from that traditional model. Now, I think that's an old school model that people don't want anymore because it's an on-demand product. If you're just, you might as well record it and play stick it on Netflix. And there's a value to that. And of course, I'm not suggesting that watching a video screen is the same as in person. There is an element to the live show, but for what I do, I can't do that. And I find it interesting that's the expectation that's there. And I'm hoping that there's actually a shift where people say, we want, of course, we want to know roughly where you're going to go with this, but we want that element of flexibility because we want you to engage your audience. We want you to veer slightly, to your point. If the room is not getting it, then you have the wherewithal to be able to shift. And we've seen some great examples of politicians that recently that are just incapable of deviating from the script. And we see how that lands with people. And so for me, you're absolutely right. I think the consistency is in the quality and the delivery. It's not going to be amateur in that sense, but it's not going to be consistent in terms of the same thing every single time, because I don't think that's what audiences want. And I certainly will not. Let me put it this way: it's not what I'm delivering for them. I can't do that.
And also there's the what of what you're delivering and the how of what you're delivering, right? Like if you're delivering the message, how you do it from day to day shouldn't be the concern, but it's not the point, right? And I think that's the thing. I mean, I hope you're right. I hope people are open to these more non-traditional methods. But again, as the person that gets brought in as the weird thing a lot, I'm sometimes surprised by how uncreative are when they're getting people to engage with stuff. I mean, particularly if we're in a 2 or 3 day conference and they've had a lot of people just sitting still in one place looking at a PowerPoint presentation where someone's talking at them and it's not interactive at all. And I think, gosh, that's really tough for the people that are taking part in that. Even if the material is really important and interesting and the speakers are good, if there's no interactivity or like liveness, as you say, I think that comes across. And I think that you're not necessarily getting the best out of people if you're not kind of forcing them to engage, because we're all human and we get hungry and we get tired and we do the thing after lunch in the afternoon where we look like we're listening. Really we're just not, because we're human. So I think like interventions when you are really engaging, changing energy, getting people to, just do stupid games and, answer questions and things like that. I mean, that was one thing I found when we were teaching on Zoom during the pandemic, is that it's so easy for people to disengage, particularly in a virtual way, that I will always just, if it's 12 people in the class or whatever, I will always just say their name and ask them something directly at very frequent intervals throughout a class. So there's an expectation of the culture of that thing. Like I am expected to engage in this and I might be called on to speak at any moment, as opposed to I'm going to sit back and like double screen it.
Right.
And actually, even for me as a person, like one of the joys I have when I'm running an improv session, whether it be for a corporate or just for people that are doing it for fun, is that it might be 2.5 hours in a week where I turn my damn phone off and I just do that. And I'm in the moment doing that activity with the people in the room. And that is something that is a rare privilege, isn't it, these days, where you get to just focus on one task with the people that are in the room. So sometimes I say, at the very least, if that's the thing you're going to take away, it's like being present with the other people that are in the room. That's a huge, massively underrated thing, I think.
And I love that comment around people's attention, because I think there's an implicit presumption on the part of many people. And I think this is almost that logic of, they are here to listen to what I have to say, and because I am important and an expert, they will listen to what I have to say. And my view is, one of the things I thought the pandemic brought out was exactly your point, is that we have to earn the right to be heard, because actually people's expectations are now that actually I can, if I don't like this, I can switch to something else, right? There are, to put it in sort of TV analogies, right, there are more channels out there than ever before. And so in the old days, you had a choice of very small number of TV channels, and that was it. And so the competition was those other channels. Nowadays, I would argue that if you're doing a session on Zoom, or even if you're in a room with people, the competition is the mobile device, right? Which opens up a whole range of things. And people could be playing games, people could be talking to their friends or their partner about dinner. You could be betting. You could be, there's all sorts of alternative forms of distraction. And so you have to earn the rights to have people's attention. And so one of the reasons I think I don't like this rinse and repeat thing is I always start from the premise of, I don't deserve them to listen to me unless I'm delivering something that's worthwhile. And I have to put effort into that to make sure that I'm doing that. And that means thinking about, what time of day is it? What state of mind are they in? How are they responding to my stuff? And adapting accordingly, which I think brings us back to your improv piece of, if I just turn up and presume that what I have is going to be, they will listen to this because of who I am, you're stuffed. I think nowadays you have to think about things. And so I think being able to grab people's attention and recognize when you've got it and hold it and are doing it well, but also recognize when you don't have it, right? And you need techniques to be able to claw it back. Yeah. And I think recognize, and that is exactly what you're talking about, is this improv thing of stuff isn't going to go according to, but maybe those jokes that you thought were hilarious didn't land. Right, they're not landing. Yeah. Maybe they've landed every single time, but today they haven't landed for some reason. We have to be able to pivot from that and to find different things. And so I think it's interesting when you talk about your, thinking about how to engage people. I think there's an inbuilt presumption in certain structures that we have, and that might be a case of seniority. It might be the format where people think I turn up and they will listen. If you say it, they will listen, and I don't. That's not true anymore. And we have to recognize that and develop formats and processes that allow that to happen, and recognize that, in different, as you say, different environments are different. So what works on one day may not work on the next, may not work with a different audience. We've got to be ready for that.
Yeah.
So that's it for part 1 of my 2-part discussion with Heather Urquhart on improv. In part 2, you'll be able to hear more about the mechanics of running an improv business, how imposing a code of conduct on a business that is of necessity creative and pushing limits poses a number of challenges. When, for example, does being funny cross the line, and how can you manage the risks that poses? All of that is coming up in the next episode. While you wait for that to come out, do have a listen to my episode featuring Neil Malarkey on a similar subject. There's a link to that in the show notes. And if you're not already subscribed to the show, or you want to see what episodes you've missed, then visit the show's website at humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with part 2 of my discussion with Heather, but in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that improvisation is a powerful skill that we should all master, and thanks for listening.